4.1 Learning A, Post-War Tensions and Society. Please add 3 pieces of information or 3 extra notes to each slide. Okay, so the Red Scare. From a period of 1919 to 1921, there was a period in the United States history called the Red Scare. Now you have to remember that World War I was partly fueled by, American entrance into World War I was partly fueled by fear of big government monarchies. The United States has always sort of had this big government fear. And Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire all had big governments, meaning the governments were monarchies or dictatorships that told the people what would happen, as opposed to the people telling the governments to. The people were slaves to the government, as opposed to the government being slaves to the people, like in a democracy. During World War I, one of the reasons the United States got in was one of the allies, Russia, was overthrown by eventually the Bolsheviks. Okay, they were communists, and the difference between communism and democracy is communism is a big government. Also, communists, by the way, use what's called a socialist economy. A socialist economy means that every single person works for the government, and the government gives every single person what they need. There's no real concept of rich people and poor people. It's an egalitarian society. Egalitarian, so equal. So that's opposite of what capitalism is, and the proponents or the supporters of capitalism want this to spread throughout the United States. So this fear was accelerated after World War I, when an enormous amount of immigrants came into the United States, and some sort of socialist rob from the rich and steal from the poor, Robin Hood style activities were going on. In fact, the big example of government reaction to the fear of government is the Palmer raids. The fear of communism is Palmer raids. What sparked the Palmer raid was that there was a terrorist attack, or a series of them. Bombs were sent to public officials through the mail. One of the people was the Department of Justice head, the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. So he used his police forces, his federal police forces, to raid people's homes and places and businesses who had been tied to communist meetings or communism in general, or people who were okay with being or were okay with communism and anarchy. Today, it's largely seen, ironically, as a big government reaction to fear of big governments and fear of communism. It was against the law. People were deported and kicked out of the country without being found guilty of any law. Here's a picture of an apartment. It's a famous picture of one of the Palmer raids. Comb City for alleged radicals. Okay, oops. Perfect case against 2,600 of. Here's a couple of political cartoons. What I'd like you to do is push pause, and I'd like you to try to identify on your piece of paper the symbols and what the artist thinks about each one. Go ahead and push pause. Okay, so the answer, as you can see up there, is that there was undesirable immigrants coming into the United States on the left, and immigration restrictions are the door. And obviously there are no restrictions on immigration, and the immigrants heads a bomb. That's obviously a sign of the terrorist attacks that led to the Palmer raids. On the very bottom of that, on the caption, it gives the artist's opinion. It says "close the gate." So the artist thinks that immigration should be restricted to stop the terrorist bombings. On the right, you see that there's a fly on this man's, on Uncle Sam's forehead. That fly represents Reds, or communists. The man is going to hit himself in the head with a hammer, and it's labeled "too drastic sedition legislation," meaning laws that restrict people from having different political beliefs. On the very bottom, it says "swat the fly, but use common sense." This shows the opinion of the artist that says, hey, it's sort of dumb to have really, really strong laws against radicals when you could just swat them. In fact, it'll hurt the United States, aka hurt Uncle Sam. Labor conflict is often looked at as socialist because, well, frankly, a lot of the people involved in labor unions are socialist. Also because the very basis of socialism is that laborers should have higher wages. Higher wages takes away money from the owners or the wealthy people. So in a form, it is a weak form of socialism, where Robin Hood style, where the rich people lose money and they give it to the poorer people. In World War I, it was a time, really good time for labor unions, hardly any strikes, and there's lots of jobs. However, labor unions started firing back up after the war because so many people had fired workers, and because governments had stopped buying war stuff, there was less jobs. Also, the Red Scare itself tended to make people more drastically afraid. There were lots and lots. In fact, there were thousands and thousands of strikes each year. But the two major examples that you can cite is a general strike in Seattle, where pretty much the entire city shut down, and that was pretty drastic. Also, shockingly enough, the Boston police strike. In Boston, the police actually struck, and a soon-to-be president, Calvin Coolidge, brought the state militia to break up the strike. Both of those really highlighted, emphasized the extreme movement of labor unions in the United States, and basically fueled the Red Scare even more. You'll notice that the ballot, ironically, labor unions use a lot of democracy in their actions. In fact, labor unions have their members vote on pretty much everything. Here on the right, you can see that the labor union ballot here, the Iron and Steel Workers ballot, has a whole bunch of different languages on it. That's because immigrants were in it. Okay, picture from the police strike, the Boston Post, there they are, and then the militia comes in, and the guy in the yellow box is Calvin Coolidge. Please do the same thing as you did in the previous cartoon. Push pause and try to figure out what the artist's opinion is and what the symbols represent. Okay, so now that you've unpaused it, you should say the answer is that the artist thinks that the striking policeman, which represents the Boston police strike, is basically helping out all of these criminals, violence, crime, disorder. They're saying that the striking policeman is actually helping them out. On the bottom, it says he gives aid and comfort to the enemies of society. So the artist thinks that the Boston police strike is basically making those police officers have chosen to become friends with disorder, crime, and violence. Not surprisingly, based on all of these things, there's a widespread amount of nativism. Nativism is a belief that people from other countries, or anybody who's not really white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, which is WASP, shouldn't be in the United States. Many of these existed after the United States. Labor unions disliked the competition for jobs, so many labor unions had nativist members. Nativists were fueled by the radical political ideas, meaning socialism, communism. The KKK was coming back in popularity, and they are pretty much anti-everything. The results were a really famous law called the National Origins Act of 1924. Pretty much completely shut down immigration, and eventually, as it was negotiated, down to 2% of the current population. Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants that were put on trial and death for officially it was for murder and robbery. Back in the day, you couldn't get paychecks. You actually went to your business and you got money from them on payday. Well, whoever handed out money got murdered and robbed, and Sacco and Vanzetti were accused. Their trial was really public. There was not very good evidence, and they're basically put to trial for their anarchist beliefs, their radical beliefs, and the fact that they were Italian immigrants. The judge in the case was very obviously biased towards them. Please answer these three questions. On the very right, 3%, pretend that's 2%, and push pause and do the same thing as far as add what the symbols are and what the political cartoonist believes. Okay, the political cartoonist believes that the only way to handle it, meaning the best way to get all of the ragtag European immigrants to make sure that they don't overrun us, is to have a 3% rate. So this represents the National Origins Act. And the artist definitely likes the National Origins Act because there are way too many European immigrants, obviously, that want to come over to the United States. This is a current immigration political cartoon. Obviously, illegal aliens is the opinion, and that doesn't actually swear. I just put buckets on there to be funny. Cultural conflicts. You don't need to write anything on those last two ones. So in 1920s, there's this flamboyant versus conservative conflict. Women's roles are changing. In 1920, suddenly more people live in urban areas. Every 10 years there is a census, and the census in 1920 was the first time that more people were counted in the United States that lived in cities than in the country. So really the flamboyant versus conservative arguments are urban, which means city dwellers who are non-religious, who focus on science and more forgiving about personal behavior and the role of women, versus groups of people that still live in the country. There's a lot of people who are fundamentalist Christians, which means the earth was made in exactly 6 days, just like the Bible says. There's no interpretation necessary. They were against new radical scientific ideas like evolution. They wanted to keep traditional values at home, which meant women were in the same roles. Also, something that's not on there is that Prohibition played a large role in this flamboyant versus conservative argument to wets, or people who wanted to be able to drink and end Prohibition, were definitely the flamboyant or urban dwellers, and the dries, people who wanted Prohibition and liked the fact that Prohibition was in the United States, were in the other areas. Another major focus of the cultural conflict, or major piece of evidence of that, is what's called the Scopes monkey trial. Tennessee had outlawed teaching evolution in schools because fundamentalism was really, really popular in a very conservative Tennessee. However, a young teacher named John T. Scopes decided that that wasn't a very good idea, and he wanted to teach evolution in his biology class. So he publicly taught it, and in an effort to bring it to trial. He was successful, and it became a big national story, and sort of became a national cultural focal point of this controversy between the two different parts of American society. Inherit the Wind is a book that you may have to read in English too. It really became this local court case. It was not a Supreme Court case. This local court case became headlines in the news. And it didn't help that William Jennings Bryan, who was the former, who was a fundamentalist and three-time Democratic Democratic nominee for president, was the lawyer on the city side, and the flamboyant side had Clarence Darrow, who was helping Scopes. Clarence Darrow was a really famous lawyer at the time. Obviously, Scopes was found guilty because, well, frankly, he taught evolution, so he was guilty. But he was ordered to pay $100 fines, but he ended up not paying the $100 fine because of some sort of procedural matter. But the result was nothing changed, but certainly the focus on the conservative versus flamboyant, or the evolution versus fundamentalist parts of society. So drinking alcohol was against traditional morals, something culturally important. It was made illegal by the 18th Amendment, and the Volstead Act is actually the law that gives the executive branch the ability to enforce it. However, people still drank. A lot of speakeasies were underground. There was bathtub gin, which is where people made it in their own bathtub. In fact, a lot of that was really dangerous. One of the unintended consequences of Prohibition is that many criminals like Al Capone ended up selling liquor and making money off of it, and having turf war over liquor. Eventually, he was not found guilty of killing anybody or anything, but the only thing they could get to stick on him was tax evasion. Churches, by law, were still allowed to make communal wine. People could make their own wine. You could actually still drink the wine or the alcohol that you had had before. So there's a whole underground black market of alcohol in the 1920s. So this is sort of another focal point of the cultural conflict in the United States, where the rural conservative areas were able to get the Prohibition to pass, even though many of the United States did not think it was okay to have Prohibition.